Hey, welcome back to the Unbelievable Podcast. I am BJ Reidell, back here with my guy, Drew Mahowald, and today we are going to continue our discussion on Dalvin Cook, as we've seen a couple of updates in the news that have come to light and shedded maybe a little bit more information on the situation that the Vikings have at hand with their running back currently uh, withholding services, if you will, while he tries to get a new contract. So we'll talk a little bit more about him. The next thing that I wanted to do today is I wanted to talk about the Wilfs and the Vikings ownership and just have a discussion about the impact that they have on the Vikings. And here's why I wanted to do that. Earlier this week, you may have seen that Ziggy Wilf and I believe Mark Wilf released the news that the Wilfs would be donating $5 million to fight, or excuse me, in the name of social justice, which is awesome. And I started thinking to myself, well, the Vikings actually have a pretty excellent ownership group. And for as much, crap as we give people like Dan Schneider, I don't think we recognize just the impact that a good ownership group can have. So we'll talk a little bit about the Wilfs, and then we will finish up with our continued prospect analysis with second round pick Ezra Cleveland. So that is the game plan for today's show. Let's start it off here with Dalvin Cook. So to catch you up to speed, what we discussed last time was the idea of what was reasonable for a contract. We had known at the time that Dalvin Cook had rejected the Vikings' initial offer, and that was kind of his response, that he wanted a contract that was, I guess, reasonable, which we spent a fair amount of time discussing on the previous episode. What we know now is what Dalvin Cook's thoughts on that term are. So he has effectively defined reasonable, and whatever it was whatever is reasonable is not what the Vikings offered Dalvin Cook in this latest update.
Right. So it sounds like he said, I think it was what, he felt disrespected, or somebody in his circle basically released that statement and said Dalvin Cook felt disrespectful, and that's or disrespected, and that's why he is holding out. So, I get it from his perspective. When you see McCaffrey get a ton of money,
right?
When you see Le'Veon Bell get a bunch of money, even after holding out for a whole year. So you see, he's seeing guys at his position get paid, even though more and more evidence suggests that teams should not do that.
Right.
He is still seeing other teams pay running backs large amounts, and so he thinks he deserves that because, comparing to his peers, Zeke Elliott, McCaffrey, Le'Veon Bell, he's up in that rank, in that elite upper echelon, if you will, of running backs. So of course he wants that money, and of course he's going to try everything he can to get there. But what's the new deal in the CBA? Something about, if you hold out into training camp or hold out into the season, it doesn't accrue, right? So
right.
The Vikings have all the leverage here based on that, because if he holds out, doesn't get his deal, the year does not count against his contract. So next year, in 2021 would still be essentially the 2020 season of his deal. So I get what he's doing. I get that he wants that. Unfortunately, the cards are just very much stacked against him to get the amount of dollars that he wants. Of course, unless the Vikings are willing to oblige and sort of, like we said in the past before, pay him for what he's already done. Seems like what some of these big running back contracts are now, because running backs hit their prime, 25, 26 years old. Dalvin's about there. And then once you get up into the upper 20s and the 30s is when, evidence shows running backs kind of tail off and their production drops. So we'll see how it goes. I get Dalvin wanting to get his, and obviously we have to understand the Vikings' perspective too of not wanting to risk the future entirely. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But that's what I think we're at right now, is Dalvin feels quote unquote disrespected. And it seems like they're pretty far apart as of now. But again, the Vikings have the leverage here.
Yeah, that question of leverage, I feel like will continue to drag on until we ultimately reach a conclusion to this contract saga, because Dalvin Cook is one of the few running backs who you can argue, there's probably 8 to 10 of them, have any semblance of leverage in contract negotiations. There just simply aren't that many that have that ability to use their body as, saying, I need more money if you want me back on the field. There just aren't enough running backs out there. I mean, think about if any of the 49ers running backs, or, if Mark Ingram, or I don't know, name your running back that isn't Christian McCaffrey or Ezekiel Elliott. If they tried to hold out, the team would probably just say, all right, we're going to go with our backup then. Because the response just doesn't merit the amount of money that these players are asking for the most part. Because think about it. I mean, how many teams, when you go to draft your fantasy running back, how many running backs are there that you feel confident are going to get 250 carries a year? Probably
right. I mean, it's impossible to expect that now. There's so many teams doing a timeshare. There's so many. There was the injury possibility of guys, so it's
right.
like there are very few true workhorse backs.
Right, and so those are the guys who have the leverage, right? Those true workhorse guys. And Dalvin Cook, despite the medical history, which is a glaring red flag, let's just make that clear for those of you who have been screaming at people like me talking about Dalvin Cook and not, shedding enough of an interest, I suppose, on the medical history. I hear you. Like, that's the biggest thing that he's got against him right here. And that's why, effectively, in my mind, and seemingly in yours as well, he doesn't have enough leverage because any leverage he has as a bell cow is effectively negated by that medical history. Because he can't guarantee, based off of his past history of success, that he's going to be on the field for 16 games. So we can't guarantee we're ever going to see a 1,200-yard season again just because we can't guarantee we're going to get 16 games from this guy. That's just facts. And I'm sorry about that because I would love to see Dalvin Cook get paid, but it's just not reasonable given his service time and the amount since he came into the league. I mean, he has dealt with 2 major injuries, right? And then a bunch of other nagging ones. So,
well, let's keep this in mind too. 2017, he goes down week 4.
Right.
Vikings fall to 4-4, or excuse me, 2-2 at that point.
Mm-hmm.
They win 11 of the final 12 games, get the 2 seed with him on the bench. So that's not, that's one angle I don't think we discussed too much in the last show was, the Vikings, the most success that they've had the last 3 years since he's been on the team has been without him on the field. Now, that's not a direct correlation, and I don't think him being on the field is a direct correlation to maybe Kirk having slightly better numbers either. We'll get into that in a little bit here as well, but that's just something that I noticed and we didn't really talk about on the last show was the 2017 Vikings were, they were dominant for most of the season, and Dalvin Cook was, when the Vikings had Dalvin Cook on the field, they were 2-2, and then they went and won 11 of the final 12 games that season, earned the 2 seed, won a playoff game at home without Dalvin Cook.
So let's investigate that a little bit more. Investigate Dalvin Cook's value relative to the rest of the team, because this is something that we haven't discussed yet within the idea of paying a running back, right? If you want to expand the conversation and just come up with a default number for all of your skill positions, and that's how much money you're going to pay, say, your quarterback, running back, wide receiver 1, and wide receiver 2. Between those 4 players, you need to, I don't know what this number is, but this is, theoretically, if you pay the quarterback less or you play a wide receiver less, you could, again, you could play the running back a little bit more. If you're going to group all of these skill positions or, I suppose like these offensive positions that have an immediate factor on the outcome of the game, then you could find a way to argue that Dalvin Cook deserves more money. At the same time, you got to factor in he's been on the field, and granted in diminished capacity a number of times, for a total of 28 games over the last 36 for the Vikings. Excuse me, the last 48 for the Vikings. That's concerning. And especially when you're talking about leverage. Okay, so he says, if he's going to be on the field for, what does that equate to?
That's probably 60%-ish.
About 10 games. Averages out to about 10 games. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to pay you a fraction, about 60% of what you think your average annual salary should be, which ends up equating to about $9 million.
Yeah, so, that's what if he's thinking $15 million a season,
right?
Then yeah, about $9 million a season based on the availability. Now, we should note the injuries he's had. Like, injuries are, I'm not a big believer in a guy being injury prone necessarily. Like, injuries are just freak injuries that just happen, and most of the time, I think it's not really something that can be controlled. But the point still stands that he's playing running back, which is The position
been
itself,
injured though.
the position itself is prone to injuries, right? It's not necessarily the player individually, but the position itself is prone to injuries happening. That's
Especially if you have that injury history, though, because that's just going to make. I mean, do you think? Just an honest question: do you trust Dalvin Cook's knee more or Christian McCaffrey's knee more to hold up over a 16-game season?
Oh, yeah, McCaffrey's.
That's kind of
right
like.
now, yeah.
I'm not like I don't want to, and I'm with you on this. I'm kind of arguing off of the point you just made that I'm not predicting that Dalvin Cook is more likely to get injured in the future. However, he does have the injury past, which suggests that he could be injured again in those same areas because they're probably just not as likely to hold up because they're anatomically repaired. I mean, I'm not a science guy. I'm not a doctor, but generally speaking, if your knee has to be repaired, that knee is not going to be as strong as it was when it wasn't repaired.
Yeah, well, tell that to Adrian Peterson.
I know, and I know someone's saying
I know,
that,
I know.
but like I'm speaking again, like he's a demigod, okay? Most human beings, right?
I know.
Okay, so if he's gonna be on the field for 60% of the time over there, and really that's an unfair average. It's more like you can probably feel confident that he'll be on the field for 12 games for sure. Okay, let's say that's the number. How much of an impact does he have in those 12 games? Like how much of an influence does his success and his ability to be a possibility of touching the football on every single play, how great of an influence does that have on the Vikings winning games? So we've looked at a couple of these advanced statistics or whatever, the next generation numbers, and Dalvin Cook does have an influence, but is it enough of an influence to justify paying him $10 million or more?
So, yeah, now here's from Next Gen Stats today, actually. And the problem I have with this, first of all, is that they kind of use passer rating, which I don't love, right? Because they equate all interceptions the same. When if you look back at last year, the one interception that even jumps to my mind when we discuss this is like the one that I think Kirk threw against the Eagles where it bounced off of Diggs' helmet. So that is this. Diggs was wide open on the sideline and it hit him in the helmet, and it was picked off. And that interception is penalized the same as Kirk's interception against Green Bay, where he threw it to double coverage in the back of the end zone. But with that said, the passer rating for Kirk Cousins when Dalvin's on the field, 114.3, with Dalvin off the field, 94.8. And that's largely because the touchdown interception ratio with Dalvin on the field was 16-1, and with Dalvin off the field, it was 10-5. So that's significant. Now we should mention, so our guy Luke Braun, who does the Locked On Vikings podcast, looked at all these and it kind of broke down each interception. So the first interception was a tipped pass at Lambeau. Tipped pass. Right. Is that Dalvin's fault, really, that the pass was tipped? Perhaps not. Probably not, right? The one in the end zone at Lambeau was with Dalvin Cook on the field. If you want to be, you could fit the narrative how you will. But the Dalvin Cook was on the field for that one. Then you have the fluky, tipped pass of Stephon Diggs' helmet. The Seattle one, a contested catch to Stephon Diggs, sort of a 50-50 ball that he lost. You have a screen pass tipped, didn't see the defender there against the Chargers. So a screen pass, sure, you can maybe argue that, but also that would mean people are paying more attention to Alexander Madison. I don't know. And then you have Kevin King jumping up and getting a jump ball as well with Diggs down the field on the Monday night game. So looking at those one by one, like it seems, I don't know. I have a hard time believing, okay, Dalvin Cook not being on the field is the reason that those other 5 interceptions happened. I don't know. That it's just.
So this becomes a question.
I don't like passer rating as a stat. I don't like the touchdown interception box score numbers as a stat because it goes back to the Teddy days where he had 14 touchdowns in 2015 and 9 interceptions, but 5 of those came off of receivers' hands, and then he didn't throw touchdowns to goal line because they handed off to Peterson every time and stuff like that.
So this ultimately comes down to the question of the age-old question and a fan favorite question, whether they know it, that they're discussing it or not. Correlation versus causation, right?
Yep.
So how much correlation is there between Dalvin Cook and Kirk Cousins' passer rating? Based off of the influence that the interception stat alone has on passer rating, you have to think that might be a product of causation and not correlation. There's not a correlation between Dalvin Cook being on the field and Kirk Cousins throwing interceptions. Now, passer rating is not the only true reflection of how Kirk Cousins plays offense. Of course, this has two sides to the story, right? We don't have to like passer rating even if it looks good for Kirk Cousins, but there are pieces that Dalvin Cook adds to the offense that maybe are unquantifiable or we're not smart enough to understand because we just aren't coaches, or there are a number of elements that Dalvin Cook brings to the game that we simply can't bring down to one number and get a good number, good justification for him being on the field. One thing I can guarantee you is that the Vikings are a better offensive football team when he's on the field, no matter what. Always, okay? I know that's simple, and I know that's a broad statement, but it's true. The Vikings are a better team when Dalvin Cook can possess the football. So we know that. So now that we know that there is some level of correlation between Dalvin Cook being on the field and the Vikings playing better offensively, whether that's Kirk Cousins' boosted performance, more or less attention on wide receivers like Adam Thielen because they have to account for the fact that Dalvin Cook might get the ball. I mean, there are little things like that, but how much? And
I
don't have the answer.
There's no way to quantify it. There's no way to quantify it. That's the troubling part for both sides in this negotiation because
if we could get a number,
the Vikings. The problem first of all is that the Vikings have this offense so heavily predicated on Dalvin Cook last season and probably going into 2020 that he's in this position to have some sort of leverage where a modern 2020 offense built on the past like it should be, there wouldn't be this problem where the running back is getting the ball, sometimes 25, 30 times in games. That shouldn't be a thing in 2020, but it is with Dalvin. And then, you look at like breaking it down the simplest terms of what matters, wins and losses. Still, I don't like using wins and losses for any player, even quarterbacks. Like I still don't even like QB wins as an argument, let alone running back wins. So 2017, Dalvin's out, Vikings win 11-12. 2018, Dalvin's healthy most of the season. Vikings missed the playoffs this past season. Dalvin is involved a little bit more in the offense, but still not healthy every game. But the Vikings do lose the big one Monday night against the Packers without him, and they get smoked in that one. So there's evidence to both sides, but my biggest argument, the one I like the most, is just looking around at the rest of the league, which teams have stud running backs, which ones are getting paid. Teams are paying running backs the most, and how they're doing. Panthers with McCaffrey, 5-11 last year, right? The Giants are riding Saquon Barkley. They haven't paid him yet. Probably going to. Giants, are they any good? Not really a threat. The Cowboys went 8-8 last season with perhaps the most talented roster in football, right? And they paid Zeke a bunch of money. Now they can't pay their quarterback. Le'Veon Bell, the Jets, same thing. They went 7-9, I think, and that was just scraping by to 7-9 with a backdoor kind of win streak at the end of the season. And his production has dropped dramatically since he joined the team. That's the biggest argument I see. I don't see a team paying a guy at running back a bunch of money and then it working out for the benefit of the team, the success, especially when you have a quarterback on a massive deal already.
So ultimately, again, we arrive at the conclusion that Dalvin Cook feels disrespected. The Vikings, probably rightfully, are offering him a contract that is more a product of not the top 5 best running backs in the NFL, but more how the top 5 organizations in the NFL operate. And unfortunately, I don't see either side really budging from that unless we get a further update or there becomes another area that one side can reclaim leverage on. And unfortunately, I don't see that dynamic changing. The one that you just stated right there, that Dalvin Cook is a focal point of this offense. He's going to hang on to that as long as he's healthy, right? Vikings are trying to be a winning organization and follow suit with the teams that have best allocated funds on their cap. I don't see Rob Brzezinski budging there. So this is a true stalemate. I think we might see this one drag on a lot longer than we would like. But that's where we stand today. Dalvin Cook, Vikings, true stalemate. He feels disrespected. The Vikings feel like they're doing what's warranted given the circumstances and the recent history at the position. So I guess we'll see. We'll look for more news updates, and I'm sure this will, like I said, this discussion will probably drag on longer than all of us wanted to. But Nevertheless, let's jump into something else here. Let's talk about the Vikings ownership. And this, I know this kind of comes out of nowhere, but I'm playing off of the headline, like I said earlier, that the Wilfs committed to donating $5 million for social justice and to fight, racial bias and all these problems that we're having in our country right now surrounding the George Floyd situation. So that is just a headline, right? It's just a piece of information. The ownership did this. I want to branch out a little bit further and discuss just how great of an ownership group that the Vikings have, right? So in my lifetime, I've lived through two ownership groups that I can truly remember, and that's Red McCombs and now the Wilfs, okay? I understand that Roger Tebrick was before that. I don't know anything about him, not even going to touch that. What I do know is that Red McCombs was an owner, and the Wilfs, as far as I know, have been amazing in every respect. So why does this matter in the first place, right? Your ownership has a trickle-down effect to everything that happens on your team. Obviously, Ziggy Wilf isn't out there taking handoffs from Kirk Cousins, but he is in charge of the business formation of your entire group, your entire organization, and he's also responsible for making sure that your organization has a responsible reputation, if you will. These are two things that he has been able to accomplish in tremendous detail and consistently since the Wilf Ownership Group took over in 2005. And that's not something we can say about every other team in the NFL. And I feel like that warrants some recognition.
It does. It does. And especially now where now there's so much going on, right? And, to be able to handle it the way they have, and they've been super generous about, donating to the right causes, things of that nature. And it's easy to get behind them is what it boils down to. And that's always been how it is with them. And even now, one example I will use here is the move to have training camp in Egan. I think it's surprising to me looking back that like the people of Mankato weren't as upset. And I think it's a lot of that is because of the way it was handled from the top down, and kind of nicely but correctly putting, okay, we need a new facility. We have this state-of-the-art thing being built in Egan where we're going to practice all the time. It makes sense to have everybody there, blah, yada, yada, yada. And I think that was really well done by them. And as they keep, like, there's it's not about the reputation to me. Like the reputation's one thing, what people think of you, all that, but they are actually, talking the talk and walking the walk, if you will. That's what's different. And so it's good. I mean, I like, we can use the Redskins as an example,
right?
Redskins,
that was the next thing I was going to say.
The Redskins franchise is struggling, and Dan Snyder is Dan Snyder. That's fine. And it just seems like it has a ripple down effect. Now they've got the issue with, is their team name something that should be a thing, the Redskins, or should it be something different?
Anything else, maybe?
And Dan Snyder has not really addressed that or seemed willing to listen to that argument. So, yeah, it's I don't have a lot more to say in the Wilfs other than it's very easy to root for them, what they've done with the Vikings, despite the Vikings aren't an easy franchise to win over the fan base anyway, right? Because there's a lot of history of losing and not a lot of success, and it seems like they've been able to do that. And with the new stadium, moving the facility to Egan, and they've been really successful as businessmen in the area, but they've been able to, at the same time, be great philanthropists as well to the right people, the right causes. So hats off to them, and I will continue to root for them.
So kind of when you think of just the average fan, like myself or you or most of our listeners, right? What do you want from your ownership? Because really, let's just be honest here. You don't really care about the ownership, right? You care more about the executives who are calling the shots.
Let's make that clear too. I don't even like I'm not 100% educated on
and
everything that they do.
And most people aren't.
I imagine I'm with the majority on that. I don't know them too like that well. But everything says that they're promoting the right things, supporting the right things. That's kind of when you're in that position of power to support the right causes and invoke change, and then you do it. That I think that carries a lot of weight.
Absolutely. And then, so in addition to doing, quote, good things, right? Being involved with the community, doing, what you can to bring about, like you said, change or just justice in general, or working towards just a better world, right? Like all of those things those are all good things for any CEO, right? Like that's what you want from, at your job. You want your CEO to do those types of things as well. Give you time off when it's deserved, right? Or, put money and resources behind causes that are truly, truly inspiring change or a better world. That's what you want from any rich person, okay? Now, what you want as a Vikings fan from your owner isn't to touch the football, isn't to meddle in the operations, especially if you don't know anything about football. So, like, the things that the Wilfs don't do are also very important, right? So, like, I know that Jerry Jones is a Hall of Fame executive, but, like, either you're going to be a personality, an owner, or an executive. Like, pick one. I know that's annoying for Cowboys fans. The Vikings don't have to deal with the Wilfs meddling between finances and personnel decisions. There's like a very strict line that's drawn there so that the business operations are separate from the football operations. And that's very helpful for people like us who just don't want to see, we've seen so many teams ripped apart by stupid ownership, whether it's financial decisions or like just kind of questionable financial decisions, whether it's doing something not so great in terms of the image of your franchise.
Like, right. Clearly treating a player incorrectly. And that's one thing, too, we should know with this Dalvin thing. Like, I am very confident the Vikings are going to find something that, Dalvin still maintains respect of the team. Like, that's still, he feels disrespected now. He's going to, that respect will be earned back. And I feel like that because of how this team has handled those decisions in the past with contract extensions, and I think that's that's a result of how the Wilfs handle things at the top, and I think that has kind of had that trickle down effect to the way like Rob Brzezinski and Rick Spielman treat the players.
Right. And then ultimately the final thing, so you want them to make savvy business decisions where you don't have to think about that element, right? You want them to treat your players well, treat the system well, treat the organization well. Those things are sort of like would be listed underneath your job responsibilities, right? And then finally, you don't want them to embarrass you. And this is something that you don't think about unless it actually happens, right? You don't think about ownership in, how do they represent me, the fan, until they truly embarrass you. And you may not think, you might be thinking that like, oh, I'm speaking high and mighty. No. These people that own your favorite organization, it becomes extremely hard to root for an organization when they are constantly embarrassing you. Think of New York Knicks fans, for example. Whether it's him yelling at the fan and saying, you can't ever come back to my stadium because he can't take criticism from a random pedestrian. Or it's like Dan Snyder, unwilling to even recognize that the title of his franchise is a racial slur. These are embarrassing things that as Minnesotans or as in maybe not necessarily non-native Minnesotans, but people who have inherited their history from Minnesota, don't even need to think about it with the Wilfs. And it just doesn't get talked about enough, the fact that I can be a Vikings fan without having to worry about something stupid my owner did. Like Jim Irsay, for example, if you're a Colts fan, he has legendary memes created about him. And I'm not saying it doesn't add to the fun or the content, but the dude seems like he's always drunk. Like, do you want that as your owner? That's not something you have to think about with the Wilfs. It's just like, it's one of those things where, like, once I saw this headline, I was like, okay, let's think about all the other good things that the Wilfs do. And while a lot of that list is composed of things that they don't do, you look at other owners and you're like, okay, you have so much money, you have so much power, you have so much public support, you could do some really questionable stuff, and they don't. And that's why I love the Wilfs. I'm a big fan of the direction this team has gone, and I'm a big fan of kind of the business character if you will. Again, I'm not a business guy. You guys know that. But the business character of this organization is a trickle-down effect of, of Ziggy, Mark, and Leonard Wilf. And the entire organization reflects that, and that's what you want to see. So
yeah. Well, I think part of it, too, is you can even use that as an example, like, Kirk, Anthony Barr, these guys taking less money to play for the Vikings up in the cold where the, income tax is probably higher. It's not on that perspective, right? For a player, income tax is incredibly high in Minnesota. The weather sucks for 5-6 months out of the year, and these guys are taking less money to play here. I have a hard time believing that the ownership has, only a little to do with that. I think it's a big deal, and that everything starts from the top up. So, yeah, I think it's probably a good thing to hammer this point down, and let's just make it clear, nobody's freaking perfect, right? Like, they could be they're doing a lot, they're doing a ton, okay?
Right.
And I hate this argument that, like, you saw, like, Zuckerberg, he's only given $25 million, that's 0.% of his net worth.
But
so
okay, yeah.
Okay, like, all right, he's getting 25, somehow that's a bad thing. Sure,
yeah, okay, buddy, yeah. All right, folks, so shout out to the Wilfs, and let's move on to Ezra Cleveland now and talk a little bit about this player that the Vikings recently brought in during the NFL draft this past April. So, Ezra Cleveland is your newest offensive lineman. He's a big offensive tackle, athletic offensive tackle. This was a type of player that I think a lot of people were targeting, given the kind of the revamp of the offensive line, the style and success of Brian O'Neill, and how that translates to potentially how the Vikings will view offensive line prospects in the future. It certainly seems like Ezra Cleveland, at the very least, takes a lot of characteristics from Brian O'Neill.
Right, that's exactly what it seems like they're doing. A zone blocking offensive tackle, can move pretty well, laterally, right? And when he gets to the second level is when he's really good. So again, in that zone scheme with the running, in the running game, that's when he's going to be really good. He can get downfield. It's the closest thing to Brian O'Neill in this draft that you could have found, and that's easily the case with Cleveland. So it seems like they have, a template that they want, an offensive tackle. They want somebody that's taller, quicker, not necessarily the largest in terms of weight, right? But a guy that can move. And it seems like Cleveland's that next guy that I don't know if he's going to be at left tackle, if he's going to be at right tackle, if he's going to be at guard, maybe to start. Who knows? With Riley Reef still in the mix. But it seems like that's the guy that they want. They want another Brian O'Neill, and they hit on Brian O'Neill, and they saw what they liked, and not a lot of that pick wasn't loved necessarily by the entire Vikings fan base. This one's received a little bit more on a positive light, I think, because of the way O'Neill worked out. Very similar player. We'll talk about the actual positives and negatives of his game, but it seems like that's what they're going for. It worked last time. I have no reason to doubt it again.
Okay, so let's talk about the basic information, right? The stuff that you can get from just Googling the name Ezra Cleveland. Stands at 6'6", 311 pounds. He's on the young side, relatively speaking. Not necessarily like an overly young player, but younger, I suppose. So big frame, not hulking frame, as Drew said, but you're going to get a lot out of his size. And the big points of emphasis are less on the physical stature and more on the athletic testing. This is an extremely athletic offensive lineman. He might be a little bit twiggy. I mean, I don't see it, but I have seen that kind of people taking shots saying he needs to gain more muscle. I don't really see that as a negative for him. The biggest question marks for me are going to be the footwork, just because it's difficult to get your feet underneath you going from college to the NFL, especially if you're going to be starting right away, which I doubt he will have much of an impact on the 2020 season. But so his footwork, and then also his ability to understand the playbook and understand kind of what his assignment is. Because when you're working in that zone blocking scheme, you not only need to be athletic enough to get out in front of the play, but you also need to be smart enough to know where you need to be in order to run that play effectively, which is, it's something that you can teach, obviously, but sometimes it's something that needs to be learned as well.
Right. I mean, yeah, that's the thing too with Cleveland. he seems like the smart enough guy, and he's going to learn from O'Neal. I think those guys are going to get along well. Plus, let's keep in mind he and Alexander Madison were teammates, so it seems like he'll really easily assimilate into this Vikings offense. So I don't think there'll be any issues there, and I don't know if he'll start right away. This Vikings team doesn't have a huge history of putting rookies into the offense right from the get-go and letting them take off. But maybe offensive tackle is different, and of course Riley Reif is a veteran who's been there for a while. So I'm sure he'll be the favorite, at least at left tackle, and maybe at guard. Who knows what the case will be there? But with Cleveland, like you said, moves around well. I think he's going to be awesome as in the zone scheme as long as the Kubiaks are around. I assume that'll be the case for the long haul here. With O'Neal and Cleveland, that kind of combination of tackles, you'll want to maximize that as much as possible. I think obviously the strength is going to be sort of the weakness, right? So when you have a guy that's not huge, not a massive lower body compared to others at his position, the initial strike, if you will, at against the defensive end, initial power right off the line of scrimmage is going to be a little bit weaker. But again, the moving around and then his pass protection as well is pretty solid too. So moving around, keeping guys in front of him, very good, and that will only improve as well. So it seems like he's sort of more into that modern offensive tackle template as the NFL moves into more and more of a passing league.
So some things that he excelled at the college level that should probably, hopefully, potentially translate directly to the NFL are, and I'm working somewhat off of Jordan Reed's draft guide, by the way. So if you didn't pick one of those up, make sure you go. I think you can still go back and get one of those, right? But anyways, that's what I'm working off of here. Is you can assume that he's going to be able to figure it out. And what I mean by that is the concerns about transitioning in terms of understanding your assignment. This is something he excelled at in college. So he was a nose tackle in high school. Thank you, Jordan Reed, for that tidbit of information. And he was able to translate over to being an offensive tackle and a damn good one within about 4 years' time. So you can assume that this player will continue to progress and continue to recognize more and more about where he needs to be as he learns and immerses himself within the offense. So to me, the fact that he's only played the position for 4 years isn't necessarily a knock because of how good he was able to get in 4 years' time. Granted, of course, he played for Boise State, so competition, is it a concern? No, because you're still playing at the highest level of college football. But for those of you SEC bias people out there, Big Ten bias, you may have some questions about that. The biggest thing for me that I think will be huge for him playing successfully immediately is that ability to get to the second level, which is a direct reflection of that athleticism, right? So on these running plays where Dalvin Cook is able to get off, assuming he is on the field, that is, if when he's able to get through that first line of defense and he starts dealing with linebackers and safeties and other defensive backs, that's where Ezra Cleveland excels. He's able to get out in front because he's fast, and he's able to hold his ground because he has great leverage and an excellent anchor. And that takes a combination of strength, speed, size, and just understanding of the position. And those are a couple of traits where you can see those directly translating for this player.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Athleticism is the big plus here. Also, we mentioned how smart he is, right? I think he's disciplined too, and not falling for fakes necessarily. Like, he'll probably get bull rushed more than he'll get beat by some finesse move in the pass rush game. Like, I think that looking at his frame, looking at what his strengths and weaknesses are, he's going to get bull rushed by some of those big freaks that are both quick and fast at defensive end or at the outside linebacker position, rushing the passer. So that's where he's going to get beat, and that happens to every tackle in the league. That's not something that would be unique to him. I guess Brian O'Neill was beat like twice the last 2 years, but most offensive tackles get beat once or twice a game based on like a bull rush like that. As offensive tackles get smaller and trimmer over time due to the modern movement in the football sport, in the game, right? That's what I'm trying to say, something like that. So yeah, he is a perfect match with Brian O'Neill. I think the next step, really, to me, is going to be how the Vikings proceed. Like, is the Kubiak tandem going to be the regime offensively moving forward past 2020? Because that zone scheme right? That's the huge run heavy offense, right? Which is still, I think it works for him because it's zone, but I still would like to showcase the pass protection more, which means I like a pass heavy offense. That's most efficient in 2020 and beyond. I want to see that better because I think the Cleveland O'Neal tandem at tackle can be really, really good long term for pass protection. And if I don't know if Kirk's gonna be the guy. I don't know who is at quarterback, but I think whoever it is will be set 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now with those two guys on the bookends.
So a lot of these questions of kind of how Ezra Cleveland will influence the Vikings are thinking more long term, right? I haven't heard either of us talk about this season yet, and I think that's kind of a fair question to close out this segment with: is do you expect any type of impact from Ezra Cleveland this year, or is this a redshirt NFL year for this player?
I think he'll start the year on the bench. I mean, and I don't mean that in a negative way to somehow diminish my expectations for his career. I just think if you have Reef, longtime veteran, not a horrible left tackle by any means, and you have Brian O'Neill has been exceptionally efficient in 2 seasons, it's tough to get him in there, right? And I don't want him to be playing guard when he's projects as a pretty solid tackle. He projects a pretty solid tackle. I don't want him getting mixed into the guard position all that quickly and kind of forgetting, if you will, with his what he does at tackle. So I would rather sit him back, have a reliable option as your third tackle, because chances are either
you're going to need it at some point,
or O'Neill will have some sort of injury, and then you can bring him in and have very little drop off in production there, if you will. So that's kind of what I want. And then it doesn't appear that Reef is going to be a long-term answer at tackle beyond this season. Might play a season or two later, but this is a pick for Cleveland to be the quote unquote left tackle of the future. And so you see it with quarterbacks all the time. They don't start right away. I think this is a case where you keep him on the sideline. If you need to play him because of an injury, you do it, but keep him there. And, you start the year with Reef and O'Neill at your tackles, and then kind of stick with, I think, Elflein at guard right now, Bradbury, and then Drew Samia maybe at right guard, and go from there.
So I think that ultimately the best case scenario for his career is maybe about 30 snaps this year. Like, check in for the last 15 snaps or so of a couple games that are out of reach, just to give him an idea of what that offensive tackle position looks like at the NFL level. Okay? So that's what I think would be the best case scenario. I don't think that's going to happen because we're talking about an NFL season that is going to be dealing with not just injuries per usual, but also the coronavirus too. So to me, I see him getting on the field as a necessity, not necessarily pushing Reef for time, right? The other option then is the guard position and being able to have, quote, your best 5 offensive linemen on the field at once. The Vikings have tried this before now with Mike Remmers. Tried to get their best 5 on the field, right? That's the goal, best 5 on the field. And it makes sense on theory. And hell, it makes sense on Madden too. It does not make sense in the NFL. It does not work. So I would prefer for him to be studying his long-term position as opposed to playing a different position and having to adapt as a sophomore. Because we've seen what has happened to Pat Elflein. And granted, there's an injury mixed in there that hasn't helped him either. But his career has been a nonstop flux of, am I going to be center? Am I going to be a guard? What do I need to do with my footwork? How much more of the playbook do I need to know? I would prefer if the Vikings handled this delicately, given their success with the left tackle position in drafting, and how the only success story in the last couple decades are Bryant McKinney not even Bryant McKinney, Matt Khalil for a year. And
Bryant McKinney was solid. That guy was good.
But he was a right tackle, wasn't he? For most of his career?
Lone Hope was your right tackle. I think you're thinking.
That's right. Okay, that's right. How could I?
Lone Hope was good too.
How could I have possibly forgotten about Phil Lodeholt?
6'8", 340, just so much humanity.
Anyways, I prefer Ezra Cleveland getting the opportunity here as a spot starter, a force starter. I do not like the idea of him playing guard just to get him on the field as a rookie. I don't think that does him any good long term. And ultimately, I do think that we need one more year to evaluate Pat Elflein too. I know he's the problem right now entering into this season. Everyone's clamoring for who's going to replace him. Well, let's talk about who's going to replace him like week 6, because the third year can be a turn year. I'm not ready to replace Elflein with Cleveland if you truly believe that Cleveland is your left tackle of the future, and I do believe that's what this pick is, then he shouldn't be playing guard. He should be learning how to play left tackle, or you should move Riley Reef over to guard and start Cleveland immediately, which, again, I don't feel comfortable with that really either.
That's the one option that I could say, okay, if you felt this guy's ready to go as a rookie, which looking back to 2018, Brian O'Neill, I think he played the second game of the year is when he first started playing. He was ready. So maybe that's the case with Cleveland. And if that's the case, play him at tackle instead of guard. I want him, if he's going to play, don't get him in there at guard. Get him in there at tackle. But yeah, you're right. Take it, approach this delicately, because left tackle is perhaps the second most valuable position in the sport, but especially the case if your quarterback is Kirk Cousins.
Absolutely. I 100% agree with that. And give us your thoughts on Ezra Cleveland. How do you think the Vikings should direct his career, if you will? Because there are a lot of paths here, and there isn't necessarily a wrong answer. There's just historical precedent to suggest that there is a wrong answer here, because Vikings have that sort of PTSD of what's happened in the past, and I don't blame you. So give us your thoughts. Let us know in the comment section below. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Leave us your comments on Ezra Cleveland or anything that we've talked about today on the Daily Norseman below. As always, you can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, Spotify, anywhere else where you listen to your podcast. Make sure to check out the Climbing in the Pocket Network. Every one of those guys is producing content in both audio, written, video, all kinds of different formats. So check that out if you haven't already. And yeah, we will be back next week, hopefully talking about something other than Dalvin Cook, but I imagine that conversation may, in fact, continue given the circumstances right now. And we'll continue our prospect analysis, I believe, with Cameron Dantzler is up next on the list. So that is the game plan for next week. Thank you, as always, for listening, and we will catch you guys next week.